Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Anthony Balester. That's Will Charlton. This is the season finale of Forever Power 5. You can follow the show across social, on Twitter and Instagram at FP5ETB and at Forever Power 5 on TikTok. As long as TikTok is still up and running. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart. You can follow Anthony at Balester555, and you can follow Will at Will Charlton H13. I got that right. All right. A bunch of special characters in that username. And you can follow the Empty the Bench Network across social media at ETB Network. You can watch all Empty the Bench shows on youtube.com/ETB Network. You can listen to all Empty the Bench shows on etbpodcast.com. And you can listen to Forever Power 5 wherever you get your podcasts. And if this show is presented by Playback, watching sports is more fun with others, but we spend too much time watching alone. Playback is a virtual space where communities can stream live sports together with everyone perfectly synced up. Creators can hop on stage, deliver their own play-by-play analysis and commentary, and invite viewers up for Q&A. Playback makes watching sports fully interactive and a social experience. From playing fantasy sports, repping your favorite players and teams, and watching with the commentators and communities you care about. Win or lose, sports are best enjoyed together. Join our community by going to playback.tv/ETB Network to find out more, including our live stream schedule. All right, so it's finally over. College, it's kind of a sad day. It's kind of a sad time for most of us. College football has the shortest season and the longest off season, and it's a very, very long off season.
Yep.
More than 6 months. It's January. We're not coming back till
August.
So that's what, 7 months? Yeah, 7 months.
Yeah, 7 months.
And that's like more than that. It's almost an entire pregnancy that we have to wait until college football is back. But of course, we have to talk about now. I know Big Ten fans are elated. I think a little bit ironically because of the way SEC fans are. So they're doing some Big Ten chants.
Back to back for the Big Ten.
Back to back for the Big Ten.
Back to back for the Big Ten.
I will say Big Ten fans that aren't Ohio State or Michigan fans are kind of like Florida fans celebrating Alabama or Georgia winning the the national championship game because they're in the same conference. I'm a Jet fan. I'm not going to celebrate the Bills winning the Super Bowl if they do. It's just because they're AFC East.
But they'll beat the Chiefs. So.
Yeah.
No.
So, we all have a lot of thoughts about this Ohio State win over Notre Dame. So I'll go to you, Anthony.
Well, I remember back in August, I tweeted out that my prediction this season was that Ohio State was going to win the national championship, and rightfully so. Obviously, when they lost to Michigan, it didn't look like it was going to come to fruition, but ended up, they ended up performing in the playoffs, and they had probably the hardest path. I mean, they had to go through Tennessee. I mean, they had to go through Texas, and then obviously you had to go through Notre Dame, and they had to go through Oregon. So this team didn't have any easy games, and it seemed like they were in control and pretty much almost walked through every single one of those teams. One thing about this game, though, is obviously Riley Leonard went right down the field, and then Ohio State pretty much neutralized them for most of the first half. And then it looked like it was going to get ugly and it was going to be a blowout. Quinton Junkins ended up with 3 touchdowns, and it pretty much looked like you didn't have to watch this game in the second half. But then Riley Leonard was able to get the passing game going with Greenhouse, and Notre Dame was able to fight back, show some courage, show some grit, and end up making this a ball game. And then Will Howard making that pass to Jeremiah Smith. I mean, that took guts and balls, and they did it to perfection. So I want to give them credit for that. Ohio State was the most talented team in the country. They had probably the best defense and one of the most, if not the most explosive offense. You got probably the best receiver in the country in Jeremiah Smith. So it's a no-brainer, and it's about time Ohio State put it all together. And one thing that's ironic is Ohio State won the national championship when the college football playoffs first expanded to 4 teams. Now they win the national championship again when they expanded to 12 teams. So it's almost like destiny for Ohio State, and all Buckeye fans have to be happy.
Yeah. I mean, this totally makes up. I mean, to me, this totally just makes up for the Michigan loss. Yeah, go ahead, Illinois fan.
No, it definitely does. Even though for some reason Ryan Day's job was being called for after that Michigan loss, because he can't be Michigan's been 4 straight losses now. But watching that game was I had a feeling going into it that Notre Dame was going to at least compete and put up a fight. They did, obviously. It took a while, but they did. I mean, right, that first drive, like Anthony mentioned, where they just went right down the field. What was it, like 9 minutes? The first drive was like 9 minutes.
Really long drive.
Riley Leonard ran it like 10 times. It worked. But then Ohio State was like, all right, we got a good defense. We can stop the quarterback run. This guy is not going to be able to run all night against us. And it didn't work until they actually started airing the ball out. And obviously, we saw with Greathouse that he was catching passes left and right. He had that phenomenal grab to give Notre Dame that their last touchdown. I said at the start of the playoff, I wasn't really too sure who was going to end up winning it, but I had this like feeling that after the first round, it was going to be Ohio State. I wasn't really sure who my pick was after the first round happened, but after I saw what Ohio State did to Tennessee, which I thought was going to be a close game. I mean, I said it on the show that I thought Tennessee was going to cover, and I was dead wrong. I thought that after that game, with how dominant they play, I was like, man, Oregon is in some trouble next week, and they were. Obviously, Ohio State put the game away in the first quarter. So it was a very similar game in the sense that Ohio State got up and stayed up. Besides obviously trailing 7-0. But I was really impressed with Will Howard. I mean, like Anthony said, that pass to Jeremiah Smith on that 3rd and long was, thrown up to the best receiver in man-to-man coverage the entire season. You know, it's just Notre Dame obviously is a man-to-man team, and they've been preaching that all year long, but you have to figure out something to do against Jeremiah Smith there. I mean, I know you're doing a zero blitz and you're trying to get pressure on Howard, take them out of field goal range, but you can't let that happen. And Will Howard put it on the money. It needed to be exactly where he threw it. And that play was the epitome of the Ohio State playoff run, in my opinion. So kudos off to the Big Ten for winning it back-to-back years. Kudos off to Will Howard and Jeremiah Smith and that amazing defense for kind of honing in after that really long drive Notre Dame had. And, most kudos, in my opinion, to Ryan Day, because he was under so much fire for the loss to Michigan once again that people are looking at it. It's like, he can't be our coach. He hasn't won a national championship yet. He hasn't beaten Michigan yet. Those two things right there are what Ohio State expects to at least expects to beat Michigan every year and expects to contend for national championships. So the fact that he hasn't done either in a while now, and obviously that just changed, but the fact that he hadn't done either in a while now, I get why he was getting pressure. I do, but I think we can kind of shove that away now and realize that Ryan Day is going to be the coach here as long as he wants to be.
All credit to Ryan Day, because people were talking about, his job is on the line and all that. What I'll say about Ohio State as a football program is that they have really, really high expectations for their head coaches. Mm-hmm. And to an extent, I'm not saying they're wrong to have those expectations, but it's kind of like you wouldn't have those types of expectations for people on in your personal life. You know what I mean? It's like they just have really high expectations for all their head coaches. It's like, I need you, Urban Meyer was their last head coach, and he's one of the all-time great head coaches, and he won a national championship his 3rd season at Ohio State, and he always beat Michigan. Now, in fairness to Ryan Day, I think the Big Ten has become a tougher conference since Urban Meyer, from the time that Urban Meyer was the head coach to the time that Ryan Day is the head coach.
Definitely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, while Urban Meyer was the head coach, the Big Ten started to get tougher. But overall, the competition that Ryan Day faced as Ohio State's head coach has undoubtedly been tougher than the competition that Urban Meyer faced. I mean, I think the reason Urban Meyer didn't go through what Ryan Day is going through is really because he won a national championship his 3rd season and he never lost to Michigan. That's the reason why. Except the problem is the first 3 seasons that Urban Meyer played Michigan, they were a complete joke. It's not like this. It's not like when Ryan Day went up against Michigan, they were a much better Michigan team than what Urban Meyer had to go up against. So that's another factor where that also needs to be taken into account. But I think Ryan Day deserves a lot of credit because you know what? He did what needed to be done. he did what needed to be done as the head coach. He made adjustments. He made adjustments. Not only did he make adjustments after the Michigan loss, he made adjustments in the offseason. He hired Chip Kelly as his offensive coordinator, and he was calling all the plays as the head coach. And he stepped back and hired an offensive and hired who I think I would say is an offensive genius in Chip Kelly. And you know what? He deserves a lot of credit for all of that. He deserves a lot of credit for making all of the necessary adjustments for Ohio State to win.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Nick. And I don't think Ohio State's going to be going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, you can make an argument that they got the best returning offensive player next season in Jeremiah Smith, and they probably got the best returning defensive player next year in Caleb Downs. I mean, that guy is so versatile. He can play linebacker, he can play corner, he can play safety. I mean, the combination of those two guys, Ohio State's going to be great next year. I also think Notre Dame could be great next year as well. They have a lot of young guys on their team in the secondary and on the offensive line, so I think Notre Dame will have another great season. One thing that stood out to me is their best player, Jeremiah Love, really wasn't on the football field much this season. And I wonder if he was injured or if that was why he didn't see the football field, because he's their most versatile player.
Yeah, no, definitely. There he is. Will is back. He's back like Texas. Yeah, no, you're right. You're totally right about Ohio State. I also like, we could talk all we want about Ohio State and how dominant they were in the playoffs in what under a season that just a year ago would have been completely over, and they would have just been sent to some useless bowl games where all their best players would have sat out, including Will Howard probably. Yeah. Which I think is very remarkable. And by the way, people would still be calling for Ryan Day's head as the head coach, even though he's one of the best. He's arguably the best head coach of the Big Ten. I think you can make the case, at least. I
mean, he probably is. He's probably right up there. I mean, I think he proved it this year that he probably is.
Yeah, he probably is.
Because the best coach last year left for the Chargers. So.
Yeah. Although I will say, it's just like, this Ohio State fans are obsessed with Michigan beating Michigan. I will say, when Urban Meyer was the head coach, and I'm not saying Ryan Day's as good of a head coach as Urban Meyer was. Urban Meyer is one of the best head coaches ever. But what I'll say, and I think he still could be a good head coach, I just don't think he wants to be a head coach anymore because it's a lot on him. It seems like being a head coach, it's kind of like being a great head coach in college football. Often, it's kind of like how having an iconic role as an actor often takes a really big toll on these actors, where it just sort of beats them down. I'm sort of under the impression that was also the case about Urban Meyer, like just being a head coach beat him down a little bit, and he doesn't want to go back to it. But what I'll say though is, like, Ryan, when Urban Meyer was the head coach at Ohio State, there were also a lot of bad losses that kept them out of the playoffs. It's just that none of them were to Michigan. I mean, don't forget, in 2017 and 2018, I would say throughout, he was the head coach at Ohio State for 6-7 seasons. And at least 3 or 4 of them, they had one really bad loss that kept them out of the playoffs. In 2015, they had that really bad loss to Michigan State at home with their backup quarterback. It kept them out of the playoffs. In 2017, they lost to Iowa by 31 points, which kept them out of the playoffs. In 2018, they lost to Purdue, which kept them out of the playoffs. So, you know what? I get none of them were to Michigan, but you know what? It seems like Ohio State seems to do this a lot, where like they lose to teams that they're clearly superior to. It seems to happen fairly often, actually, I would say. And it happened a lot under Urban Meyer. It really did. And people forget that. But frankly, losing to Iowa by 30 points that year, or losing to by 31 points that year, losing to Purdue, losing to Michigan State with their backup quarterback at home, I'm not sure those losses really are any worse than the Michigan loss this year. I think the thing with the Michigan loss is that they kept trying to play Michigan's game. They tried to out physical Michigan.
That's why they lost it. I mean, that's why they lost it. They were playing Michigan's game the entire time, and Michigan took advantage.
Yeah, and like I said, credit to Ryan Day for taking the bull by the horns and making those adjustments. As far as the game went, now I will have to be clear about this. I had bets. I won all my bets except for my unnecessary wager. And I realized midway through the game it had no chance because Jeremiah Love was a total non-factor that game.
Yeah.
And by the way, I had the same reaction as you when I saw the opening drive with Notre Dame, where there were a lot of design runs for Riley Leonard. He was running between the tackles quite a lot, which I was surprised they were able to get away with Ohio State's front. And the drive lasted almost 10 minutes. But what I knew was that they weren't going to be able to continue that. I also knew that I knew that wasn't going to happen every drive. And I also knew that Ohio State was going to score a lot more quickly, and it would still be very difficult for Notre Dame to be able to keep up with them. But I was honestly impressed with that drive. But I had Ohio State minus 8.5, and at halftime I hedged it and took Notre Dame plus 20.5. It hedged my bet, and I also had the over, by the way, which I was never too worried about. But I ended up taking both sides, and at different points in the second half, I was really worried about both bets. At one point, I was like, it looks like Ohio State's going to cover the 21.5. This isn't good. And then at other points, it was like, Notre Dame's going to end up covering the 8.5, and that almost happened. I am so grateful that Mitch Jeter somehow doinked that field goal. I am so grateful because I would not have won that bet.
Also, I will never understand why they kicked it there. In hindsight, I guess it makes sense, I guess, but in this situation, it does not make sense why they kicked that.
You know what? It makes sense. I understand both sides of the argument. On one hand, it's like, all right, they go down. How much time was left in the game? 10 minutes?
I think 8 or 9, but still,
8 minutes, 9 minutes, something like that.
Going, you were down 16 points. Prove that you can still hang around.
Yeah, I get that. I guess the other side of the argument is it's a lot better. It's a lot different to be down by 16 than by 13. That's another thing that I think makes a pretty big difference. And it was such an easy field goal. And at the time, Notre Dame's defense was actually looking pretty good at that point.
Yeah, I mean, ironically enough, it was the first time they forced him to a 3-and-out the entire game. After that moment.
Yeah, and I was holding my breath that. I was so glad there was just a little bit of time left on the clock that Ohio State ended up kicking the field goal because we were this close to Ohio State just kneeling it after the Jeremiah Smith reception.
Yeah.
We were this close. I mean, look, I don't think anybody's really all that surprised by what ended up happening. But we were talking about Ohio State redeeming themselves after that really bad Michigan loss. I will also say, by the way, when with Ohio State having 2 losses, a lot of that was just them playing a tough schedule in their division in the Big Ten. I mean, they had to play Penn State and Oregon on the road and Indiana at home. That's probably tougher than what the schedule that any other Big Ten team played. And the reason they weren't in the Big Ten championship instead of Penn State. And Penn State made it instead is because Penn State didn't have to play Oregon in the regular season. I also think Ohio State only lost to Oregon because they were the road team,
or Michigan or Indiana too.
Yeah, well,
either of them.
Yeah, although I don't know if Michigan really counts. I think Penn State would have killed Michigan this year. Knowing Penn State, they would have killed Michigan.
Probably.
I think they would have killed Michigan. But Ohio State, they really didn't get the luck of the draw, and similar to what I was saying about Georgia and how their schedule was a gauntlet, I think Ohio State was built for this. I really do. I think they were built for having a tough schedule. But
I agree.
In a weird way, though, they did get screwed by it. They did get screwed by having such a tough schedule in a lot of ways. But also, we were talking about redemption for Ohio State. The same thing is true of Notre Dame. I mean, after they lost to Northern Illinois, who would have thought they'd be in the national championship?
Still one of the most mind-boggling losses, I think, of all time.
Yeah, because every week it makes less and less sense.
Yeah.
Every week it makes less and less sense. Yeah, it is. And Notre Dame has a lot of those mind-boggling losses because usually when those losses happen, it turns out the team's not that good. Like when Florida State lost to Georgia Tech, it's not like Florida State came back and they were a really good team. We're like, how did they lose to Georgia Tech? No, Florida State just stunk. That's usually, or Texas A&M a few years ago when they lost to App State. It turned out Texas A&M just wasn't a good team.
Yeah.
Usually that's the case. But in Notre Dame's case, they actually just turned out to be a really good team that just played unbelievably awful. I guess they needed to hit rock bottom in a weird way, Notre Dame. It seemed like they needed to hit rock bottom.
And one thing we definitely got to bring up is, man, the job that Marcus Freeman has done with this Notre Dame team. I know they didn't win the national championship, but man, I think certain schools winning national championships are much harder than other schools. Notre Dame is one of the toughest schools to win a national championship with because of how hard it is for them to recruit the top athletes, because of how hard it is to get into their universities. The GPAs you need to get into those universities are much harder than some other schools. So they can't ever recruit at the level of like an SEC team or a top tier Big Ten team. So the fact that Marcus Freeman could get this team all the way to the national championship after bouncing back after that tough loss, one of the worst losses in college football this season to Northern Illinois. I mean, this is why we see teams like the Chicago Bears interested in Marcus Freeman. I know it's a little too soon, but this is why he's one of the hottest coaches in college football and in all of football for that matter. And I think in a few years, he's going to continue to build his resume. And, while we said Ryan Day has established himself as probably the second or third best coach in all of college football, I think Marcus Freeman has established himself as one of the top 5 coaches in all of college football as well.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah, he's done a tremendous job at Notre Dame. He really has. And speaking of head coaches, Sark got a 7-year extension. I think this is a very good move. I think that you have to hold on to. I think that schools I think that college football programs have to hold on to quality head coaches as long as they can. That's how I would put it.
Yeah, this is a no-brainer. I mean, Steve Sarkisian's got this team to back into the Final Four teams. I mean, he's pretty much got this team as a perennial playoff contender, and he's kind of like in a similar situation to Ryan Day, where he's getting basically right there, just outside of winning a national championship. And just like Ryan Day did this year, I think in a couple years, Steve Sarkisian will eventually win that national championship. I mean, what he's built at Texas, and I mean, if you look at his recruiting classes this year and the last couple years, it's been, one of the top tiers in all of the country. So he's turning Texas into a juggernaut. Like I said, I know maybe some Longhorn fans might be upset that they came up just during the playoffs, but honestly, I don't think they got nothing to complain. I think what Steve Sarkisian has done with Texas is the best that any coach has done with Texas in probably about the last 10 to 20 years. And he's one of the premier coaches in all college football, and he easily deserves his extension.
Yeah. And by the way, we were talking about redemption, and this is a little bit different, but don't forget, 9 years ago, Sark was fired as the head coach of USC because of his alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have thought he would come back and rebuild a football program that was in Texas that was just floundering at the time that he took over? I mean, Texas, they went through so much trial and error with different head coaches. They went through Charlie Strong, Tom Herman. I don't know where either of those guys are now.
I couldn't tell you either.
And it was amazing to me how they had a network. They started the Longhorn Network when the team was they were going 6-6 every year in the Big 12. Texas was so bad for such a long time. I mean, it didn't work under Mac Brown. It didn't work under Charlie Strong or under Tom Herman. I don't know if I'm forgetting anybody. If there's been any other head coaches.
That just proves how relevant they were if you are.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point.
And
so they've gone through so many, this revolving door of head coaches, and they were really just floundering. They were like what Michigan was 10 years ago. They were a really big brand that was completely floundering. And Sark I think he took over in 2020 and he brought the whole program back. He brought it all back, and to the point where they may have been the second best team in college football this year. I mean, Georgia kind of had their number a little bit, and we criticized them a fair bit, but they were still one of the best teams in college football, and they did pretty well in the SEC. Their first year in the SEC, which is a much tougher conference than the Big 12, obviously. And Sark I think, like we were talking about Marcus Freeman, I think Sark also deserves a lot of credit, and he really earned this.
And at the end of the day, Texas is 1 yard away from being in a national championship potentially. Because, I mean, they literally had the first and goal at the 1 yard line. Then obviously it ends up being the Jack Sawyer fumble return that sealed the game. And
his former roommate, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Right. No, that's crazy. The thing is, Texas has competed for a national championship in back-to-back seasons. Texas fans can't be mad about that. They can't be. I get that you're expecting to want to win it all every year, but so many teams expect to win it all every year. Ohio State expects to win it all every year. Michigan expects to win it all every year. Texas, Alabama, I can go on and on. Like Georgia, I can go on and on, like I said. So Texas is, I think this is, like Anthony said, a no-brainer because Sark has brought Texas back. Like we had that little moment when
is Texas back, or are they back to not being back?
We had that little moment when who was when they beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. I can't remember what year this was, but
this was 2018.
Yeah, and then oh goodness, what was the quarterback's name?
Of Texas?
Yeah, when he said we're back, and then they weren't back.
Forget.
Sam Elliner?
Really blanking out his name right now.
Is it Sam Elliner?
Yeah, probably was.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, so like Texas is actually in such a great spot right now because they are bringing in recruits. They are loading up with talent each and every year. Sarkisian has been phenomenal for that program. And I don't expect to see Texas going away anytime soon. So it makes all the sense in the world to prove that you're still going to be a title contender for 7 more years. In my opinion, I think that they'll be up there every year. Like I think that there's no reason to believe they won't be up there every year.
Just like Notre Dame, I think they'll be up there every year.
Yeah. So it's a no-brainer, in my opinion, that Texas did this because Sark has proven that he revived this program. And I mean, Texas, like we were saying, like a huge brand that was down for so many years, but now they've been competing for national championships back-to-back years. They were 1 game away back-to-back years. So.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that I think a lot of college football fans expect dynasties from their head coaches, which I don't
do it in college football.
It's very hard. First of all, you especially can't do it now with the NIL era.
Exactly.
Like, I don't think Nick Saban would be as dominant at Alabama if it was during the NIL era. And by the way, I don't think that's bad for college football at all. I think it's good for college football that we're not really having all of these dynasties where the little guy gets a little bit more of a chance in a sense. Not even like the little guy, but the medium guy really gets a little bit more of a chance where like now under the NIL era, a lot of college football players don't want to be backups. They don't want to be backups whereas like, you know, there might be a school that is a little bit lesser, that might be a little bit less, a bit smaller of a brand that might offer a player that would be like a school like maybe like Texas might offer, say, a defensive lineman who would have been a backup at Alabama to be a starter at Texas, and they'd be able to make more NIL money or whatever. Something like that, which never would have happened beforehand, before the NIL era. And also, even in that era with dynasties, what were the dynasties? Alabama, Clemson, Georgia. I mean, Alabama was by far the biggest dynasty, but when we look at dynasties, Clemson, they only won 2 years. Georgia won 2 years in a row. So Clemson and Georgia, outside of, and Alabama, they won within the past 10 years. They won I think they won 3 times. They won 3 times in 10 seasons. So between 2014 and 2024. And
that checks out.
Yeah, that was by far the biggest dynasty. So even then, dynasties were not very easy unless Nick Saban was your head coach. So is that the standard, Nick Saban? But now it's especially difficult. I think we're going to be seeing different teams winning the national championship from different regions and conferences. Before last year, when Michigan won the national championship, from 2013 to 2023. Or 2022, whatever it was, 2020, the 2023 national, the 2013 season to the 2012-2013 season to the 2022-2023 season. 9 of the last 10 national champions were in the Deep South, and 6 of them were SEC teams. So Ohio State was the only exception. And now I think that seems to be shifting a little bit, whereas the last 4 teams in the national championship were Northern teams. Now, maybe I'm reading into that too much. It might not really mean all that much. Things just kind of happen, and I'm not saying that there's not going to be another SEC team in the national championship. I think there could be next year. But I do think that is very much a product of NIL that we had, that, that there hasn't been an SEC team in the national championship in 2 years. So I do want to get into this. The biggest surprise from the 2024 season. Negative. Okay, so here's I think I have a few in mind of the biggest surprises in a good way. The number one biggest surprise, pleasant surprise, was Arizona State.
Yeah.
Arizona State, I don't know what their wins over under was this year, but I think you would have had amazing odds.
Weren't they projected last in the Big 12?
Yes. I really wish, I would like to talk to anybody who had an Arizona State Big 12 champion future preseason. I would love to have.
I would too.
That would have been an amazing bet to make.
Yeah.
Because you would have had amazing odds.
Oh, yeah. I mean, plus 3,000 maybe.
Yeah, I don't know what the odds would have been. I mean, there's a few others too that I can think of that were really good surprises. Indiana.
Yep.
SMU. Those were also really good surprises. Am I not thinking of anybody? Yeah, Indiana and SMU, I would say, were really good. Maybe arguably Boise State.
Well, just the Ashton Genty story alone. I mean, we barely even knew who the guy was coming into this year.
No, that's true.
And then you find out he rushes for like 5 touchdowns and 500 yards against Georgia Southern. It's like, whoa, who is this guy? Then he does the exact same thing the week after against Oregon.
So I would say those teams. You know, who was a little bit of a surprise this year, honestly, was Vanderbilt.
Sure, I mean,
a little bit. I mean, in a moderate sense, and South Carolina a little bit too.
Yeah.
They were not far off from being a playoff team if Lenora Sellers doesn't get hurt, if they don't get screwed by that call against LSU.
Too bad they couldn't wake up the cheesiest coach.
Yeah. But, like, my thing is, I think the biggest surprise this year was Arizona State. It was Arizona State, but you got to throw SMU and Indiana in there. The thing with SMU and Indiana, certainly SMU. Oh, another team maybe was Colorado. I think Colorado was a bit of a surprise too, and BYU.
BYU for sure, yeah.
But I do think SMU, being the surprise that they were, was a little bit of a product of them playing a weak schedule. It was a little bit of product of that, but they still won the games.
The thing is, like, a lot of people said that they could be a contender in the ACC at the start of the season. I kind of did see it based off what their roster was. Like, I didn't necessarily think that Preston Stone was going to pan out as the quarterback. I didn't think it was going to be Kevin Jennings taking over.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people are saying, like, watch out for SMU as a dark horse in the ACC, and they were.
Yeah. So those are my 3 biggest surprises. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, Nick. I mean, you pretty much hit the nail right on, perfectly on all those. I think the one for me is I think Arizona State would be my second. It's very, very close for me. We're splitting hairs here. I would just go with Indiana. I mean, what Kurt Sinetti did with that team, with all those transfers coming, I mean, they were a complete unknown. And then all those transfers, like Curtis Rourke and all those great defensive players turned out to be some of the best players in all of college football. Obviously, you got Arizona State. You had Cam Scatterbo and Sam Levitt, who really took their game to the next level. But for me, it would have to be Indiana. But you can't go wrong with either or. Zan, who's not unfortunately not a part of this episode, did say his biggest surprise, which it's not a surprise what his answer is going to be, is Illinois. His biggest surprise was Illinois being able to win 9 games and being able to win a bowl game. I mean, what they were able to do this season was unbelievable. And, you definitely got to put them up there as one of the biggest surprises.
Yeah. I totally forgot about Illinois. Although I don't think they compare to the Arizona State level.
Hey, here's the thing. Illinois doesn't lose to Minnesota 10-2. What do you do with Illinois?
Yeah.
The 2 losses are on the road to Oregon and Penn State. What do you do with Illinois?
Yeah, I don't know. With the 12-team playoff, the thing with the 12-team playoff that is a problem, I think, is that, like, under the 14 playoff, it was sort of easy to rationalize any decision that they made. Yeah. Well, not any decision, but, like, there was a clear rational answer most of the time. Whereas with the 12-team playoff, it is way harder to pick 12 teams than it is to pick 4 teams. Mm-hmm. like college basketball analysts, they have a much harder time picking 68 teams than college football analysts do picking 14 or what is now 12 teams.
Yeah, are we keeping it positive for now, or can we?
Yeah, we're keeping it positive. Go ahead.
All right,
Whatever you got.
positive for now. Well, I mean,
We're gonna be negative later.
You know what my answer obviously is my biggest surprise. I mean, I projected my Fighting Line to go 5-7 this season. Like I looked at our schedule, I was like, I don't know. I just don't really see how this team makes strides compared to last year. Like I think we had the pieces to possibly make a bowl game, and I thought our ceiling was 8 wins. But when we started 4-0 and beat Nebraska on the road, I was like, are we good? I was like,
I don't know what to do about that. I'm not supposed to feel this way.
Yeah, like it's like this isn't how Illinois football goes. And at this point in the season, we're at best 2-2. But no, I think that's my biggest surprise for sure. And the fact that we beat South Carolina, we beat an SEC team for the first time ever in program history. Like it was the first time ever that Illinois had beaten an SEC team in program history.
Yeah.
in the Citrus Bowl. And I was I couldn't believe it. Like it was watching that game, I was like sitting here, I was like, oh my God, Illinois just did this. Like this is a 10-win season for Illinois football. And I'm telling you guys, Illinois is a sleeper to do some damage next year because Illinois returns 18 of 22 starters. And Luke Altmaier could potentially be one of the best quarterbacks in the country, in my opinion. So I will obviously I'm biased saying that's my big surprise, but genuinely, like it even surprised me. So and then I mean, obviously Arizona State, like we kind of nail on the head that Arizona State is just it's kind of an obvious answer. I mean, that was one of the coolest stories.
Well, I mean, your Illinois pick was a little biased.
Sure.
Yeah.
But Arizona State, I mean, like watching Cam Scadaboo play like on Friday nights, like the late night game, like it was like, this guy is incredible, man.
Yeah.
Like the first time we heard his name, it's like, this is a fun team to watch. And I was really, really hoping that they could beat Texas. I mean, they were that close.
It's not for that targeting call.
Yeah.
Non-targeting call. There's
Right.
a good chance Arizona State wins that game.
Because they'll at least have a chance to kick it for the win. If the 15 yards gets added there, I mean, they're already in field goal range because of that. So they'll at least have a chance to kick it for the win. But I think also as a Big Ten guy, I want to say Indiana was a huge surprise because Indiana was I think they were 2-10 last year. I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, they were 2-10. They were arguably the worst team in the Power 5 last year, arguably. And frankly, under Tom Allen, they had like been the worst team in the Power 5 since they had Michael Penix. Like Indiana was just there was like 5 fans at every game, at every home game for Indiana. And then they started showing up because they actually did something with Kurt Cignetti this year. But Indiana was definitely the biggest surprise of the Big Ten this season, in my opinion, because no one, and I mean no one, thought Indiana was going to be nearly as good as they were. I mean, people are saying they might make a bowl game. Like, I don't know. I mean, we're not really sure what this Kurt Cignetti guy is going to do. Brings in his James Madison guys and other transfers, and Curtis Rourke becomes a really reliable quarterback. So I think Indiana was a really big surprise for me too.
Yeah, no, you got it. You got to include Indiana up there. I mean, I never would have thought Indiana would be a playoff team. That would have been like the most random. Yeah, that would have been the most random.
Now, granted, we can go back to the schedule discussion again. We can, but they won.
Which is not unfair. Games.
They won 11 of the 12 games they had to play, and and the only loss they had in the regular season was to the eventual national champion. So
yeah, and both of those points I think are totally fair. I mean, like under like the super conference era, scheduling is just out of control.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of like there are teams in the same conferences that play such drastically different schedules, and something needs to be done about that. I think something needs to be done about that. Okay, so now on to the negative. Biggest disappointment from the 2024 season. There's a few I can think of. I would say the biggest disappointment, I think there's one very clear answer. Just like I think there was a clear answer with Arizona State. The very clear answer here is Florida State.
Oh, yeah. That's actually
Florida State's got to be the biggest disappointment. They were I think they were the fastest team to clinch the under for total wins.
Probably.
But I think that's an actual fact.
I'm sure you're probably right.
I think their over-under going into the season was 9.5?
It had to be up there because the ACC
it was really high. And this has to be the biggest disappointment, Florida State. They just totally whiffed on a transfer in the transfer portal. That's really just what happened.
Yeah, Nick, I guess I'm thinking the same way as you. Obviously, Florida State's the easy pick. I mean, even if they would have won like 6 or 7 games and been just bowl eligible, that would have been a slight disappointment. But, I mean, damn, they were in the conversation for one of the worst Power 4 conference teams in all of the country. So that's a huge disappointment. A less obvious answer that me and Zan are both going with is my Roll Tide, Alabama Crimson Tide, not making the college football playoffs. I mean, obviously, we didn't expect Kalen DeBoer to win, the college football playoffs or go deep into the playoffs for that matter in his first year, but we at least expected an expanded 12-team playoffs for him to at least be competitive and at least make the first round. And, after getting destroyed by Oklahoma, their season was pretty much over. And for Jalen Merrill, one season to be basically a top 5 Heisman vote getter, to then be basically a liability by the end of the season, that was a complete disappointment. So obviously we got to put Alabama on this list of disappointments.
Yeah. I mean, and by the way, look, I'm not saying they're as big of a disappointment as Florida State, but I agree with you completely. I mean, the fact that them not being I think Alabama was in sort of a similar position as Penn State, which is that they had to make the playoffs. They didn't necessarily have to win it all, but they had to be a playoff team. And unlike Penn State, who won all the games they were supposed to win, Alabama didn't. Alabama had a few really bad losses to Vanderbilt and what turned out to be an awful Oklahoma team. And by the way, I mentioned Florida State as my disappointment. Oklahoma's got to be up there too. Oklahoma was a disaster this year.
They haven't proven anything under Venables yet.
No, and we're going to get into that a little later, but Oklahoma's got to be up there, biggest disappointments. Another team that I have to add as biggest disappointments is USC.
Yeah.
USC has to be a huge disappointment. They started off the season riding high with that win against LSU. But you know what? Their offensive line was all a bunch of freshmen, and their quarterback was also a freshman. The team is very young. And you know what? They were like right there in so many games. They were like right there. They were 6-6, but really good for a 6-6 team. And they just couldn't close out games. They couldn't play 60 minutes of football. That was the problem. They couldn't play a full game. And that's another really big disappointment. I think part of it is just, it's tough their first year in the Big Ten as a Pac-12 team. And I get not all teams struggled in their new conferences, but it's always going to be difficult on some level. So I get all that, but yeah, that's another huge disappointment is USC. I got to throw USC in there. But yeah, go ahead. Give your disappointments, Will.
How about Texas A&M and LSU? I think
so.
I think both of them, here's the thing. Brian Kelly was brought to LSU thinking that he was going to lead them to the promised land because he was so, I guess he was very, very good with Notre Dame.
Well, look at all the championships he won with Notre Dame.
Right. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. LSU fans, they had this huge thought that they were going to be up with become a perennial SEC top tier team because they're hiring Brian Kelly. He hasn't done anything for them yet. And I think that with the lineup they had, they were biggest loser from the first week of the season when they lost to LSU. Or USC, sorry. And then Texas A&M, I know that it was Mike Elko's first year. I know that, and they still have room to grow. But that felt like that team should have been so much better than actually what that loss to Auburn on the road was really bad. They shouldn't have lost that game to Auburn. I mean, I think the reason I'm thinking that is because Mike Elko said we're looking at Auburn. I think that's one of the reasons I'm saying that, because if they don't overlook that Auburn game, there is some huge implications going into that Texas game. Huge. And there still was technically, but there are even more massive implications going into the Texas game. So, and then also losing to Texas at home. That you can't do that as Texas A&M. You just can't. That's a game you're kind of expecting.
I understand that. Well, in fairness, I don't know if I totally agree, because I think that Mike Elko I think Texas A&M was actually fairly good this year. They just had some really bad trip-ups. They tripped up really bad in look-ahead games.
Fair.
I think that after they beat LSU, they were riding really high, and that's why they got killed by South Carolina. And you know what? I think that is very much a product of coaching. And I'm not saying that makes Mike Elko a bad coach, but I think it was the same thing with Alabama and Vanderbilt. I think that was also a little bit of a look-ahead game for Alabama, and that's why they lost. It may have also been what happened with Oklahoma. It may have been a bit of a look-ahead game for Alabama, and they were focused on beating Auburn and playing. Not that Auburn's a better team necessarily, but they were focused on the playoffs, and they weren't focused on that game. I think the best head coaches, they go to every game, like the Sabans, the Urban Meyers. They go to the Kirby Smarts. They go to the Harbaugh. They go to every game as if like, all right, we got to win this game. They give every single game, including the easy games, the same energy, and that's why they're great head coaches. I think that's what separates the Nick Sabans from the Mike Elkos.
Yeah,
I'm not saying Mike Elko is a bad head coach or that Kalen DeBoer is a bad head coach, but they're not what Saban was, at least not yet.
Yeah,
and that very much is a product of that. I mean, you want to talk about disappointments? Alabama's defense specifically was a very big disappointment.
That's true.
They were specifically a very big disappointment. I mean, I'm not used to Alabama looking like a Big 12 team. I'm not used to that, and that's because of coaching.
Yeah.
Very much because of coaching. Because Kalen DeBoer is an offensive head coach.
Got to give DeBoer some time. I also want to say one more thing. I think that even though they weren't necessarily expected to be nearly as good as last year, I think Michigan had a pretty disappointing season.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on
that. I think that it was just, even though obviously you beat Alabama, you ended up winning 8 games. You ended up going 8-5, but still 7-5 regular season at Michigan after what you've just done in the most recent years. I get it. Sharon Moore, first-year head coach, didn't have a quarterback who could consistently play. But honestly, that's the biggest loser on the team is the quarterback room there.
That was such a disaster. I mean, they've gone through. I mean, first of all, this was how bad their quarterback.
4 different quarterbacks throughout the season. 4.
Yeah. Well, I remember. Okay, so they initially had Warren Davis, and they had to bench him because he kept throwing to the other team. And then they put in Alex Orji, they had to bench him because he couldn't throw at all.
Yep.
And then they put in Jack Tuttle, and he may have been the best one of all of them, but then he ends up literally retiring in the middle of the season because of all the concussions. I really don't like it when people younger than me retire. It doesn't make me feel very good. That was the worst part of it all. And who was the 4th one?
Or maybe it was just 3. But
I think it was just 3.
I don't know. They ran through a million quarterbacks, but still, the fact that they couldn't keep a stable quarterback the entire season is just like.
Yeah, but look, I agree with giving Sharon more a chance.
The roster they had, that should have been at least an 8 or 9 win team, at least.
Yeah, I mean, look,
regular season.
Sharon Moore is not Harbaugh.
No.
He's not.
And like I said, there's a benefit of the doubt that first-year head coach like Mike Elko, for instance, like first-year head coach, give a guy some time to figure things out. But with that roster, like they had such a good roster. Like that defense was still just as good as last year, arguably.
However, they ended the season with great momentum. That is also undoubtedly true.
They did.
I mean, the fact that they beat Ohio State, they ended up getting a commitment from Bryce Underwood, who is the #1 quarterback prospect. I don't know how good he's going to be, but the fact that they ended up getting him, I mean, just the momentum is totally in Michigan's favor right now. I also want to talk about the hottest, who's on the hot seat in 2025. For me, I think there's one very obvious answer. There's one very obvious answer, and it's Brent Venables. He is on the hottest seat going into 2025.
I thought you were going to say Mike Norvell.
You know what? Mike Norvell's got to be up there too. But also, the thing with Mike Norvell is they hit rock bottom. I don't. You know what? You got a point. Mike Norvell's got to be up there too. But I think Brent Venables might be a little worse.
Yeah, I mean, he hasn't done anything with Oklahoma at all yet. So
he's been. I mean, like people are criticizing Lincoln Riley, but my God, has Oklahoma fallen off since Lincoln Riley left for USC? It almost reminds me of how the Cavs looked when LeBron left for the first time. That's what Oklahoma reminds me of a little bit. I mean, their offense was so unbelievably bad. Talk about a bad quarterback situation. Oklahoma's wasn't quite as bad as Michigan's, but they had a bad quarterback situation. And they And they ended up firing Seth Luttrell, their offensive coordinator, in the middle of the season. They are such a disaster, Oklahoma. Well, yeah, go Anthony. Go ahead. Who's your hottest seat?
Yeah, obviously you guys both mentioned the obvious answers with Mike Norvell and Brent Venables. Another obvious mention is Billy Napier. Obviously, he got some momentum at the end of the year with Florida, but if that team doesn't stay competitive and continue moving in the right direction, I think Billy Napier could be out of Florida. I want to give one less obvious answer, a big name. I know Nick D's not going to agree with this one, but Lincoln Riley. If Lincoln Riley doesn't go out there and make the playoffs or at least get 9 wins, I mean, you're looking at a head coach who's now had 4 straight seasons without making the playoffs, 2 in which would be in an expanded 12-team playoff that he couldn't make. And then if he doesn't get to the 9-win mark, I mean, that's 3 straight seasons where he would have 5 or more losses and 8 or less wins. I mean, you can say what you want about Brian Kelly, but at least Brian Kelly has at least hit the 9-win mark every season he's been there. Lincoln Riley's only did that one time in his tenure. So I'm not saying he has to make the playoffs to save his job, but I think if he doesn't hit 9 wins and he has another 8-5 season or less, I think you definitely got to look at Lincoln Riley on the hot seat. Zan said he's going to put Kalen DeBoer on the hot seat. I think it's a little too soon. I think he should at least get a 3rd season. But he's
the Alabama fan, and you're not even putting him on the hot seat.
No. And finally, Zan wants to put Brian Kelly on the hot seat because he can't stand the guy.
I think he can't stand the guy with the fake Southern accent.
Oh my goodness!
That's how you know Brian Kelly's losing. He's using his regular accent.
That was such an embarrassing video.
But yeah, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I'm going to give a not so obvious answer too. I mean, this guy took the only Group of 5 team to the college football playoff and now has done nothing at Wisconsin. Luke Fickell. I think he absolutely should be on the hot seat for next year. Wisconsin, when Wisconsin hired Luke Fickell, they were expecting to be a Big Ten perennial powerhouse, especially with this new playoff era. Wisconsin has gone 6-6 and 5-7 the past 2 years. They were the team with the longest active bowl streak in the country until this year. And Luke Fickell was, I mean, this is a guy who was a coordinator at Ohio State. He thought he was going to get the Ohio State job instead of Ryan Day, and he wanted to come back to the Big Ten despite it to Ohio State. But Wisconsin has been awful. They've been terrible the past 2 years. Wisconsin football was so good. To their standards, they were so good under Paul Chryst until they had to fire him because his shtick was kind of running out, I think. But Luke Fickell has to be on the hot seat because if Wisconsin doesn't at least win 6 or 7 games next year, I mean, they fired their offensive coordinator, Phil Longo, for bringing them this air raid offense to Wisconsin, who's always been a run first team. Yeah. Wisconsin has never not
seen Wisconsin do air raid.
I know. And it never made sense to me watching them play. So you got to put Luke Fickell on the hot seat. And one other thing I will say, and I don't know if you guys are going to agree with this. Honestly, going back to the biggest losers for a second, Nebraska did not exceed expectations like they were supposed to this year, in my opinion. I know Dylan Raiola was a freshman. I'm not going to put Matt Rule on the hot seat yet, but I'm saying if they don't really make too much progress next year, you might have to kind of start wondering what's going on with that.
I think they had a pretty good season compared to.
I mean, they made a bowl.
Matt Rule's done a pretty good job. I think Matt Rule is a good coach. I think he got a bad rap because he couldn't win at Carolina, but he didn't have a quarterback. I think Matt Rule is actually a fairly good head coach.
Sure.
So I do want to talk about most exciting things to see in 2025. For me, the most exciting thing to see, first of all, I will say, I think the most exciting thing to see is going to be something we don't expect. So that we're not going to be able to predict. That's what I think. Kind of like how I think the most famous musical artist 5 years from now, you might not know who that is. I think it's the same thing now. I think it's the same thing with college football. I don't think we're going to know. But if I'm going to pick anything, Arch Manning. Arch Manning is going to be the most exciting thing to see. And he's also going to be very talked about. He's playing at Texas, and obviously because his last name is Manning.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I absolutely agree, Nick. I think he's going to become the face of college football. And Zan said the thing he's most excited to see is the Ohio State-Texas rematch. I mean, what I'm very excited to see is all these second-year sophomore players. I mean, we had so many great freshmen like Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, Colin Simmons, Dylan Stewart. I can't wait to see the progression of these guys in year 2. And then obviously, like you said, Nick, to see Arch Manning, first-year starter. I mean, this guy is basically like Peyton Manning, potentially, if Peyton Manning had legs and athleticism. So to see what this guy's going to be able to do on the football field since following him from high school, it's going to be very interesting. Same thing could be said about Bryce Underwood, this generational quarterback coming out of high school. He's probably going to start for Michigan. So I'm very curious to see how he's going to do at the college level. I'm also going to be interested to see first-year starter Julian Sand, the guy who's probably going to take over for Will Howard at Ohio State. I know Ohio State's got great weapons, but to see him, he's got first-round NFL potential as well. And then lastly, the thing I'm excited to see is John Maynard, the quarterback that transferred to Oklahoma. I mean, what he did at Washington State last year, I mean, he was one of the best quarterbacks in all college football that nobody's talking about. And he might be the reason why Brent Venables' job gets saved next season.
Yeah. Go ahead, Will. Who's yours?
I am very excited to see the emergence of DJ Lagway. I want to see how Florida does next year, because that was a very young team this year. I want to see if Billy Napier, if he just needed time. Like I'm really excited to see how Florida does next year. I think that Florida is going to be one of the most interesting stories in college football next year. And I also want to, even though Illinois beat South Carolina, I do want to say I'm looking forward to seeing how Lenora Sellers does next year. I think both DJ Lagway and Lenora Sellers are going to make really big strides next year. And at the end of the day, it'll come down to coaching. So I'm really excited to see the strides that Florida make, that South Carolina make, and obviously, of course, that Illinois makes, because 10-win season, why not shoot for more next year? So.
Yeah. So 2025 early predictions. All right. So 2025 early predictions. One of them is I think USC is going to make the playoffs. I think they're going to sneak in. I'm not saying they're going to be one of the best teams. I think they're going to at least going to be able to sneak in. I think Michigan will be a little better than they were last year, but are going to miss the playoffs again. That's another prediction. I also think Alabama will end up making the playoffs. And I think LSU will have a similar season as they did last year. Those are my main predictions.
Death taxes, LSU winning 9 games.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the last 2 years, I correctly picked a national champion. And obviously, it was pretty easy with Michigan and Ohio State because luckily they had the most NFL talent heading into the season. This year is going to be a little tougher, and obviously it's way too early for me to give my prediction. But I would say right now, looking into it as we stand today, Texas I really, really like. I mean, with Arch Manning, with Colin Simmons, Ryan Wingo, Anthony Hill, all these players that they're going to be returning back. Steve Sarkisian, another year at Texas. I really, really like Texas next year. One of my predictions, I do think I agree with Nick. I think Alabama and Kalen DeBoer's second year, I think they are going to make the playoffs. My other bold predictions, I think Colorado is not going to be bowl eligible. I think they're going to win less than 6 games next season. I also, that's going to be with Deion. If Deion does return, I still think that does happen. And then Zan's predictions for next season is he thinks Indiana will miss the college football playoffs. He thinks Notre Dame will go undefeated. Ohio State will repeat as Big Ten champions, which I don't think they won the Big Ten champion, but he said they're going to be Big Ten champions. And he said one Power 4 conference coach will be fired mid-season, but he doesn't know which coach.
Well, that's not that great. If anybody, I think it'll be Brent Venables, like I said.
Probably.
That's going to be fired mid-season.
Probably.
All right. So now we're off to – wait, we did yours, right, Will?
I guess not.
We didn't. I'm sorry. We didn't go to you yet.
I don't even know what to say. Let's see. Well, it's just so hard to think about what's coming up in almost 8 months. I always like kind of hate doing this because you always look like such a dumbass when it comes back to it most of the time, especially me with my predictions usually when it's way in the future. But I don't know. I'm going to go on a limb and and say that Texas wins the SEC. Texas emerges as the SEC champion next year, avenges their SEC championship loss this year. I think Illinois goes to the Big Ten championship game.
Okay.
I think that there will be 7 teams in the playoff compromise of the SEC and Big Ten. And I think that let's go on a limb and say UNLV makes the college football playoff in the first year under Jim McElwain.
All right. Not Jim McElwain, Dan Mullen.
Or Dan Mullen. Sorry, Dan Mullen, Jim McElwain. I got my Florida coaches mixed up.
We're coming up at the end of the show. I just got to do unnecessary wagers. It's for next year. It's a short one. Iowa State plus 2.5. Clemson minus 1.5 against LSU. But Iowa State's they're playing Kansas on the road. They're playing Kansas State. Notre Dame minus 2.5 against Miami. I really like that one. Alabama minus 9.5 against Florida State, although that might I don't know how either team is going to be exactly. And then Texas plus 3.5 against Ohio State on August 30th. So these are all August 30th. These are all like week 0 and week 1 games. August. So the week 0 game is Iowa State and Kansas State playing in Dublin.
Farmageddon week 0. How about it?
It's going to be a good game.
So that's our show this week. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And this was the season finale. So we'll see you all next year. We'll do our next show next year. I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Anthony Balester. That's Will Charlton. So see you guys in about 7 months.